Good morning, everyone. So, after a very long time, we are we are resuming the class. All right. So, let me take a quick revision because, as I've told you, it's almost a month. We have started. We have taken the class. Okay, guys. So, we have started with the developments. We completed the admin part, the configuration part, the non-coding part, and slowly we are also understanding how the customization works in the Salesforce, how we can code something. And we have learned so many of the basic things so far. Well, I could say that almost all of the basic things which requires you to understand the coding, to learn the coding, and to have a practice. That all part have been completed so far. It's a good thing that before going to vacation, we at least managed to complete those all basic things related to the codings. And now from this onward, from today, we are going to start with a very important topic called collections. So collection is from here we are after this, once we have learned the collection part, we really going to start with some of the serious codings, the actual programs what we generally use to construct in the Salesforce Apex program. So before that, whatever we were learning, that was a kind of introduction, like how to program the things, how to code the things, how to write down a code and everything. What is a class, the object-oriented principles, what does it means by the methods, what are the functions, what are the procedures, what are the parameterized methods, what are non-parameterized methods. So we were being learning all those basic things. And it's a good thing that before going to vacation, this everything has been completed. And I can now assume that you all gave plenty of time to revise the thing, to have your own practices. Because for almost every batch, people used to say me that when I would ask them, what are you practicing right now? You're on to which topic? So they usually say me that they are learning a topic which, I mean, 2 to 3 topics back, whatever I have taken, they are learning that. And they are always lagging with this because programming requires uh, a certain amount of time to be get invested for the practice. But because usually you don't get the time, you always lag into the things. If I'm taking something today, probably you are practicing this in the next week. Why? Because just give me a moment. Okay. Yeah. So because this requires a significant amount of time. But since you get this almost a month, you have get for your own practices, I can now assume that every one of you are onto the same track or onto the same topic, right? All right. So let me now start with the collections. Let me now start with the collections. See, somewhere in the discussion, I have introduced this word called arrays. And I have told you, I mean, we have learned this when we were being learning for loops, particularly enhanced for loop. When we were being learning a topic called as iterative statements. So there are 4 different kinds of iterative statements: while, or there are 4 different kinds of loop in Salesforce Apex programming: while, do while, for loop, enhanced for loop. So particularly to learn the enhanced for loop, I have told you one thing, that the enhanced for loop can only be applied onto collections. If you wanted to understand, if you wanted to solve certain examples on the enhanced for loop, so the enhanced for loop would only be applicable, is only applicable onto the collections. But that time, because see, we were not in a position to learn the collections. So otherwise, I mean, but we also have to understand for loop at the same time. So I have taken a topic called as arrays. And I told you that arrays is also a collection. We are going to learn something more about this. Array is a collection, and we are also going to learn something more about that. So if you would remember, let me try to recap all those things. See, arrays, when we try to store a variable, when you try to store a value, one single value, let's say I wanted to store one integer, one string. So we obviously define something called as variables, isn't it? Let's say you wanted to store a value called 34. It's a number. It's a number. Just one value, one integer value, one integer record. You wanted to store one integer record so that you could use this in somewhere down in your programming. You wanted to use this number 34. You wanted to use a string called as Qasim or something else, whatever it could be. What we are going to do in that case, we're going to define a variable. We're going to define a variable for that. So for example, I would define a variable called as num1, integer number. That's how the syntax goes. You first of all would have to mention the data type of that. And then variable name, and the value is optional. We know this all. At the time of declaration, at the time of defining a variable, you could give a value, you could declare a value, or else in the program, you can give the value. That is perfectly fine, no problem. But the important thing to understand, the point of discussion right now is the variables could only store one record. Variables could only store one records, one value, not record, one value of a particular data type, of course. Now let's say I wanted to store more than one values, maybe of the type integer, of the type string, of the type id date, any primitive data type, any primitive data type. There are two forms of data type: primitive and as object. So I wanted to store multiple values of the same data type. Let's say I have 10 integers, 10 strings, 10 IDs, 10 date, 10 booleans. I wanted to store them. But then I'm not going to define all separate variables for the individual values. That means if I wanted to store 10 integers, I'm not going to define 10 separate integer variables for them. Rather, I would be making a use of arrays. So we learned this all. I'm just trying to make a revision of all those things. See, what is an array in that case? What is an array? Array, if we wanted to go with a technical definition, we could say that the array is a collection. Yes, of course, it's a collection. Why? Because it could store, it have a capability, it have the ability to store more than one values. So it's a collection, but it's a collection of what? It's a collection of similar elements. Array is a collection of similar elements. And there is a technical name for that: homogeneous values. Homogeneous. So all those values which have the same attribute, which have the same data type, they belongs to the same properties, they all have same properties, they belongs to the same group. They are called as homogeneous values. So array is typically a homogeneous collection. And there are few more drawbacks with the arrays. The first, it could store, although it could store multiple values, but then it could only store the values of the same data type. You cannot have an array where there are few of the values are integer, few of them are string, or maybe something else. You cannot have an array like that. But now I would ask you one question. All right, I'm giving you this command to unmute yourself. You can do that now. Let's think about a scenario, a real-time scenario. Well, let's say you wanted to store the details, a real-time entity. For example, I wanted to store, let's say, the details of a student, a candidate. What could be the entities? What could be the individual entities or individual things I would probably would require to represent an information related to a student? So it could have like student name. If I wanted to record the student details, I first of all would ask him, what is your name? So that name, if I wanted to store in terms of Apex, it goes in the string form. I would ask you, what is your roll number? That goes in the form of integer. If I would ask you, like, what is your address? That again goes in the form of string. All right. I would ask you, what is your date of birth, admission date? That goes in the form of date. And there is multiple types of that. So basically, whenever I wanted to store, in most of the cases, in most of the real-time scenarios, whenever we wanted to store the details of a particular real-time entity, we have to club a lot of different things, a lot of the entities of different data types, and we have to club them all, we have to group them all in a single representation. And we know what is that? It's a class. It's a class. So that time I cannot make a use of an array, because array could only store similar data type elements. Whereas in most of the cases, we would require a different form of collection where I could store heterogeneous values, heterogeneous records, heterogeneous things. I mean, those values which are having a different data types. So particularly in those cases, we would have to use something called as collections. So we have three different forms of collections: list collections, set collection, and map collection. List collection, set collection, and map collections. We have three different forms of collections: list, set, and map. Now see, let me talk about few more things, few technical things now. I mean, apart from this, that array can only store similar elements, cannot store dissimilar elements. Array have all homogeneous values, it couldn't have heterogeneous values. There are few more drawbacks that are associated with the arrays. See, whenever you define an array, like I have defined an array called as num, at the time of definition itself, you have to give the size. There are two ways to do that. Either you can give a size, I mean, you can give the values. Compiler would automatically going to calculate that there are three integer values are being there inside this array. So accordingly, how much? Let's consider if one integer would require, let's say, 10 bytes. This is just an assumption. This is just an assumption. So 10 multiplied by 3 would be 30 bytes are going to be reserved. There are two different ways. I mean, you can mention the size over here, integer num equals to new. This is one. I mean, here I'm giving the value. The other way is like, the other way is, this new integer array, and let's say 3. And then move on into the program and you can supply the values. So literally there are two different ways to do that. Either I can give the values, compiler will automatically going to calculate, or at the time of defining the array, I have to, but see, giving the size is mandatory. If you wouldn't give this, compiler is not going to accept the statement, it's going to throw you the error. And this error would say that you must define the size of the array. And this type of memory allocation, I mean, at the in the beginning itself, when you are declaring an array, at the time of declaration, at the time of defining an array, you have to give the size. Without knowing the size of the array, compiler would not allow you. Apex runtime engine would not allow you to define that array. This type of memory allocation is something called a static memory allocation. Static memory allocation. So the arrays follow a pattern called a static memory allocation. That means you always have to give the size of array at the time of declaration itself. And this is something, I mean, see, if you have defined an array with the size as 3, that means this array is going to store 3 integer values, right? I cannot make any changes to this while going inside in the program. I cannot ask this array to store 4 integers, 5 integers. It cannot store, it cannot hold more than 3 because you already have defined that. If you wanted to store 2 of them within the capacity, that is possible. And this would, I'm telling you, this is again a drawback. See, I cannot store more than 3 integers into this. I cannot expand it. Let's say in the beginning I was not sure how many integers I have to store. So I defined this array with like 3 as a size, hard-coded size. And later when I move on to the program, I realize that I may require to store 10 integers. I'll have to come back and then I'll have to, I'll have to I'll have to delete this 3 and again hard-coded this with them. So every time you have to do the same thing. That means you cannot ask an array, see, I have defined you 3, but can you please store more than 3 integers? It would say, no, it's not possible. Why? Because array have something called as a static memory allocations. Array follows that pattern of allotting the memory. So you cannot expand or you cannot shrink. You cannot add or you cannot reduce the size. You cannot make the changes in the size of array during runtime. During runtime, more importantly, during runtime, dynamically. Dynamically, you cannot make the change because array follows a pattern called a static memory allocation. Acha, this tends to one more drawback. This tends to one more drawback. What really happens? Let me dig into the concept and tell you one thing in more detail. I usually don't do that because I don't have much time. But at least for few of the coming days, your class would be for 1.5 hours. As I have announced this 7:30 to 9, so I almost have 1.5 hours. So I wanted to utilize for a few days only. I would going to be start a new batch very soon. The next month, so you are going to get reduced that time. Half an hour, we're going to cut it off. But right now, at least I'm having time, so I'm trying to utilize that time for more and more explanations. See, there's one more drawback with an array. If you have so many arrays in your program, if you have so many arrays in your program, so it tends to produce a problem, one internal problem with memory called as garbage. Garbage. I'll tell you what it is. See, for example, I have defined an array. And I have defined this array to store, let's say, 5 integer values or 10 integer values. Let me see how many of them I could draw over here. Right? How many of them I could draw? How many of them? Oh, all right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. All right. So I would say that I have defined an array to store 6 integer variables. But during runtime, I have only utilized 2 of them or maybe 3 of them. And then there is some amount of portion of memory is actually is not consumed, is not used. But this particular portion of memory cannot be utilized for any other purpose till the scope of a program. Till the scope of a program. That means, see, for example, you define a class and this is your scope of program. Whatever you are writing, this is called as a body of the class. So till the time the control is inside this body of the class, you are under the impression of this class, you are under the scope of this class. This memory, although is not used, but it cannot be allotted for any other use. You cannot use this memory. So what would happen, guys? What would happen? For example, let's consider that I have defined 10 arrays, and there are some significant portion of memory is freed in every one of them. Let's consider, just an example. All right. Let's consider there are 200 bytes of memory which actually have not been used, including all of those 10. But we cannot allot this 200 bytes to any other purpose till the time we are inside in this program. What happens is, like, whenever every executing quantity program, particularly Epic's runtime engine, when it starts executing a program, it would allot certain amount of memory. Although we don't have to worry about that. See, I'm again saying we are dealing with object-oriented programming, not procedure-oriented. So we literally don't have to deal with this. We don't have to worry this about this whole internal things and all, because we are doing the coding at high level and we don't have to. But still, being a good programmer, these are some of the attributes of a good program, that you actually don't have to worry about this, but still you would take care of all this. So I wanted to enhance your knowledge a little more about this. Just instead of knowing the arrays and collections, I wanted you to know few more things, because